Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the panel, which is about basically book talk by Professor Amitav Acharya. Well, the book, original title of the book is The Once and Future World Order, but as he just talked to me that the Korean title, the translation of the book is titled somewhat differently, with somewhat different nuance. It is 21세기 지정학, so 21st century geopolitics. So I think well, the Korean title and the original title gives us somewhat different nuances. But anyway, Professor Amitav Acharya is a very well-known international relations scholar. He is a very distinguished professor of international relations at American University, Washington, D.C. And he holds their UNESCO chair in transnational challenges and governance at the School of International Service. Professor Acharya has expertise in and has made contribution to the wide range of topics in international relations, including constructivism and ASEAN and Asian regionalism and global international relations. Well, we have talked about that in the previous session, and some of our scholars are also involved in this endeavor. And he was the first non-Western president of the International Studies Association, ISA, which is, I think, our own members are attending the conference quite regularly. Without further ado, I'll give microphone to Professor Acharya and give him enough time to explain what your book is about and what you are talking about in that book.
Thank you. So I can speak from there?
Or here, well, as you like.
Well, I think some people may not be able to. I like to see the face of the audience.
Okay.
So, is that microphone working there? Yes. Okay. Korean Association for International Studies for inviting me and organizing this panel. And I have done a preview of this book last year in Kanda, and but never. That was before the Korean edition came out. So it's really a good opportunity to share some of the ideas, and also because this is an academic audience, not a policy audience, I have specially tweaked the presentation to fit an academic audience, how a book like this could be useful to both undergraduate students, graduate students, and also the faculty that teach international relations and world order. So I will keep note of the time so that I don't go over time. Please give me a second. Okay. So you can see the English version. There are two English editions, one from New York, the yellow cover, and there is the white one, also has a hardback and a paperback. This is from London, Basic Books, and John Murray, a very old publisher in Britain, has published the paperback. And now there is a pocket book as well, but that is not available outside of UK. And then the Korean edition, which is I believe taken from the American edition. So it's the same text, there's no change. So just that prices can vary and the distribution varies. Right. So I think this New York Times book review actually sums it up very well. That it's a 5,000 years of world history to show how different cultures developed varying but comparable ideas of empire, great power politics, intellectual exchange that mediated relations across continents until the relatively recent and disruptive rise of the West to global dominance. That's a pretty nice summary of the book by New York Times. International Affairs talks about something similar. That's the Chatham House magazine journal, the first journal of international relations ever. The Foreign Affairs was modeled after this, but International Affairs is far more progressive now, more inclusive. Foreign Affairs still sticks to, they did a review for the book, but it's like, okay, because they are basically, they feel they are the target. They are very establishment-oriented liberal magazine. They will never publish anything like this critical of the US-led liberal order, unless it is one of them. But International Affairs was kind enough to say a monumental exercise in transformation across places and periods, translation rather, meaning exchange of ideas, disciplines and audiences, and extracting patterns from millennia of history across dozens of world orders. So I think this is basically two of the reviews say, but I think I can talk about my own argument, my own ways. So four main ideas. World order, which is very broadly defined, ensuring stability and dispelling chaos. I use the term order and chaos meaningfully because these are translations of the Egyptian language, pharaonic language, hieroglyphic language of the struggle between chaos and order. If you go to the Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, you see a plate, which is produced in my book, or palette. It talks about King Narmer, the founder of Egyptian dynasty, Egypt's old dynasty, the foundation of Egyptian kingdom, basically, who unified Lower and Upper Egypt, basically dispelling chaos by defeating enemies and establishing order. So Egyptians use it, the two terms, Maat and Isfet. Maat usually virtue, justice, order. Isfet is chaos, instability, injustice. And this, you might call it dichotomy. World is not really dichotomous in the same way, but at least in a very graphic way. That's how policymakers throughout the world, throughout history, have seen order. Leaders have seen themselves as establishers of order against the forces of chaos, whether it is Egyptians or Sumerians or Indian or Chinese or Persian civilization or European civilization or United States. American presidents often say now there is axis of evil or axis of chaos or axis of interior, something that the other, we have to defeat Iran, we have to defeat Russia, we have to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War, North Korea, or for example, North Korea is now good friends with Trump, so that's not so much in the news. But certainly Russia, China, and Iran has been bracketed as the axis of chaos. That's exactly the word. So chaos comes back to 3000 BC, King Narmer in Egyptian language. So broadly, dispelling chaos and establishing stability. You can include justice and economic development, but that's basically the broad terms that we use to define order. At a given period of time, I use that because no world order is permanent. So world orders like nation states of civilizations come and go. And the American-led world order has been around for just over 80 years, and it's almost fading now. The European world order, which was established by European colonial powers, might have lasted for 300 years, but it ended. The Roman, the Indian, the Chinese, no world order actually lasts forever. So we have to talk about a given period of time. And also, no world order is truly global. A lot of world orders are actually regional, meaning you might have, you probably would have read John Fairbank, his book, The Chinese World Order, edited book, 1979, I think. So China never had a global order. Chinese world order is the tributary system that extended only to a small part of the world, including East Asia and Southeast Asia, and to some extent South Asia and Central Asia. But Fairbank, the doyen of American-Chinese sinology, called it a world order because, and this is the key, when a civilization or a region thinks of its ordering principles, ideas, institutions, or practices are not only good for itself, but good for the world. They're universal. That is a world order. So in my book, some people don't get it, But if you look seriously, and it's very clearly explained, most world orders are regional. And so there are therefore Persian world order, Egyptian world order, Indian world order, Islamic, Chinese, then you go on European. Only the British and the Americans came close to having a global order, truly global per person. But that did not last. I was not really global. I mean, Britain could not control continental Europe because of the balance of power system. And the United States considered itself as a universal world order creator. But China was not part of it. The Soviet Union was not part of it. India was not part of it. But Americans thought what they are creating is universally applicable. And so this is where, on Henry Kissinger's book, World Order, which is this book is an argument against that. But on one point, I do agree that no world order is truly global. The argument here is that world order is not a monopoly of any civilization, whether it's European civilization, Western civilization, or a Chinese civilization, or Indian civilization, or Islam, but a shared creation. Shared creation, I'll explain in a moment. The shared creation can happen through independent innovation, meaning many different civilizations or nations or regions can develop very same ideas or similar ideas, if not exactly the same ideas, about power, authority, interstate relations, diplomacy, free trade or open trading system, rights of people, protection of people. They can develop it independent of each other. So we are not necessarily learning from another, whether from the West or from China or from Islam or the like. But sometimes they also learn from each other. So there are two ways of creating the diffusion of, creating sharing, meaning of sharing. One is independent parallel creation of similar, if not same ideas. And second, through diffusion. So there are some examples of diffusion, like a nation state diffused from Europe in many ways. The idea of diffusion is not a one-way street. The rest of the world learning from the West. That did happen, but mostly after the 17th, 18th century. But before that, the West borrowed a lot of ideas from other civilizations. So including, I'm not talking about technology, like printing press, which might have movable printing come from Korea, for example, or Chinese paper or gunpowder. That's, we all know that. But I'm talking about political, philosophical ideas. How to manage world order, or the idea of a bureaucracy built or created through competitive exams, which is a Chinese invention. That's China's most famous contribution to, most consequential contribution to world order is not paper or gunpowder. Somebody would have invented it sooner or later. But the Chinese, the first one to develop a meritocratic civil service based on open competitive exams that Europe adopted and US adopted. That's a clear pathway to diffusion, very, very clear how Europeans are influenced and the Americans are influenced by that. So you can read a chapter in my book. But similarly, the ideas of republicanism, idea of property rights, there are a lot of pathways to diffusion. Philosophy, the idea that the world, not the world order per se, but the world was created not by God, but by natural forces, was a Greek idea, in many ways lost in the time of the rise of Christianity, but it was substantially revived and extended and in fact reinvented by Muslim philosophers, Arab philosophers in the 12th, 13th century, which then became the basis of the European Enlightenment. So there is a clear diffusion and circulation. Without the Islamic revival of Greek philosophy and enrichment of that philosophy, there would be no Renaissance or Enlightenment. So that's a key argument of this book, and this looks at the diffusion path. And also you can talk about ideas like from India, the idea of zero. It's not just a mathematical symbol. It's the basis of all science and rational philosophy. Again, you see diffusion. So I do talk about then two ways of sharing, through independent innovation and diffusion. Another reason why independent innovation is so important is because we often forget about it. If you think everything is diffusion, connected, connectivity is a very big word these days, right? But not everything is connected. Sometimes things happen because human beings, which, by the way, came from one place, from Africa that we know of, sometimes develop very similar solutions to similar problems, no matter where they are and how far they are separated. So the Inca civilization has ideas of organizing empire and governing its empire that are very similar to the Mongols, or one of the Indian empires called Guptas. But we don't have no evidence that the Incas had any connection with the Mongols or with the Indians. So that's another amazing thing about this. Don't think of connectivity as everything. Because then if you think of connectivity, it generates a kind of a bias that everything came from Europe and everybody else learned from it. Sometimes civilizations independently innovate similar ideas. Okay, so then I go on to say that many of the foundational ideas and institutions of the contemporary world order, today's world order, not 19th century, not 5th century, or 12th century BC, today's world order came from multiple civilizations. So I'm talking about our present world order, which are ideas such as sovereignty, territorial integrity, balance of power, hegemony is a form of world order like empire, and hierarchy, open seas, what we call freedom of the seas, economic interdependence, republican ideas for governance, humanitarian principles of war. Many of these ideas that we consider as the foundation of today's world order came from multiple civilizations. This is why I reject the term liberal order, because the liberal order, the moment you talk about liberal order, we are hardwired into thinking liberalism originated in the West, because the West has never given credit to other civilizations for creating ideas that are actually liberal. But we'll read John Eikenberry's work. How many times he talks about the idea of freedom of seas actually came not from the British Empire, not from the United States hegemony, but from the Indian Ocean. Now, had he done that, I would think liberalism is acceptable. For me, it's not acceptable, because it automatically associates with an European idea, which it isn't. And secondly, there's a very dark side to liberalism, which is extreme racism. If you look at the founders of liberalism, including Immanuel Kant, but also John Stuart Mill, David Hume, the rationalist, and a few others, their views are extremely, extremely racist. Now, sometimes, when you read about enlightenment, you know that the majority of enlightenment philosophers divided the world into the superior races, white European versus the rest of the world, the categories of racism. Immanuel Kant being a leading proponent of racial classification. So Woodrow Wilson was a racist, and that's why the Woodrow Wilson School, where Professor Eikenberry used to teaches, has renamed itself because his racism became rampant, came to the fore, became more. It was always known, but it was never really explained or highlighted in a direct way. So that's why, and he's one of the founders of the liberal order. So you can go on and talk about Hugo Grotius, again, the father of international law, modern international law, mistakenly was both an imperialist and a racist in many ways, and a monopolist at the same time. So that is one reason why I don't want to use the term liberal order. What is liberal is actually universal, because these ideas came from many, many different places. I have carefully traced all these ideas through multiple civilizations, through either independent innovation or parallel creation or co-creation. So that's the most controversial. I think I'll like to be challenged by that, but nobody has challenged it. They just get excited about the fact that about the next two arguments. The decline of Western dominance is inevitable, but also not necessarily a catastrophe. That's what gets people very excited in the West, are angry. Because I actually say bluntly that decline of Western dominance is actually good for world order. Good. Why? And very carefully, the word is Western dominance, not the end of Western civilization or end of Western way of life. the dominance of the West is very short span of life, 300 years out of a world history of 5,000 years. And that dominance has disproportionately benefited the Western countries. Now, you might think West is declining. I don't want to get into that debate, but the fact is just there's no question whatsoever that the vast majority of the benefits of that period of Western dominance has accrued to the West. And the United States is a big beneficiary of that, but so is also Europe. The rest of the world has benefited disproportionately and more recently. You might say that the Northeast Asian countries, the East Asian miracle happened because of American dominance. Okay, there is some credit to be given there. But for a long time, this part of the world, actually, in a sense, it was doing quite okay before the arrival of Europeans. But since the advent of European colonialism and dominance, no region has done very well outside of Europe and the settler civilizations of settler states like the United States, Australia, and South Africa. So it has also created, I'm sorry, I'm going to get some water. It has also created a sense of inferiority complex. The biggest legacy of colonialism is not that countries have become so poor and deprived, and that has happened, but they're coming back at it. But it created the mindset of Western dominance, psychological sort of sense of inferiority. And this is something that post-colonial writers have highlighted. I'm not the first one. So decline of Western dominance is actually, in some ways, creates a more level playing field psychologically, but also materially. And it's not going to be a catastrophe. I'll come to that argument that, the world is on fire, and if the West goes, the US dominance disappears or declines, the whole world will collapse. My argument is that that's not going to happen, by the way. The United States and Western European countries are not going to disappear. They're going to be relatively declining, already happening, and that's inevitable. But instead of bemoaning that decline, try to accept it and make something out of it. Take this as an opportunity. And this sense of pessimism, by the way, that decline of Western dominance is bad for the world, is only found in the Western capitals and a very few other countries where the countries, their national security and economics is very closely linked to US dominance. But the majority of the countries in the world do not see the decline of Western dominance as necessarily a bad thing, because they started from and this is proven by opinion polls, they started from a low base. They can only do better. The emerging world order is not multipolar, but multiplex. I don't believe in polarity. The language of polarity, whether unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, only describes only small part, maybe a consequential big part, but not the entire sort of gamut of what world order is about. World order is actually about three things: power, ideas, and interactions. You can have a lot of power, but you don't interact well enough. You can't create a world order, it will destroy it. So United States is very powerful under President Trump, but its interaction is so bad that the American world order is collapsing, not because of American power is declining. I don't buy that line that US power is declining per se. It remains the most consequential power in the world. But its interaction capacity, interaction quality of its interaction is declining. Not only declining, it has become completely the obverse of what it used to be. And that's why we talk about world order. So world order is not about how many powers you have, militarily or economically powerful states. I talk about ideas, norms, interaction capacity, and the whole variety of things. And also, it's not about great powers. Polarity is always about great powers. What about middle powers? What about regional powers, like South Korea, Indonesia? Indonesia is a slightly better example because it's not a ally of the United States in a formal sense. And Mr. Prabowo is trying to do something to move it toward the US. It's going to fail. Let me just tell you that Indonesia's attempt to move closer to the US will not last. The country's psyche is built around active and independent foreign policy, and I study Indonesia for most of my academic life. So what I'm saying is that without bringing in ideas and interactions and just focusing on power, which is the language of polarity, doesn't give you the full sense of world order. So that's why I call it multiplex, multi-complex, complex, not even multi-order, that different orders coexist. The thing is, how do they interact with each other? That's more important than just having multiple orders, multiple poles. And I also think this is an opportunity to get beyond the West versus the rest divide. That this West, there is a West which is kind of pristine and pure and more virtuous, depending on who is talking and when one is talking, more advanced, racially superior, intellectually superior, versus there is the rest of the world. And that divide is a good opportunity to get rid of it now. It has never been really a real thing. Both the West and the rest are very artificial, modern constructs. There is no real West in the 5,000 years of history that I have examined. It's only mainly after the Cold War started, but a little before maybe in the 19th century Enlightenment started. The rest, the global South, is even more recent. It started with the decolonization. And by calling it West versus the rest, and this is not just the Western scholars, but also a lot of scholars from the non-Western global South that like to sympathize or empathize with the global South. They talk about West versus the rest, and they don't do any service to the prospect for world order. And this is one of the policy recommendations that I will make out of the book that try to build cross-cutting cooperation, which is happening now. In my article in Foreign Policy called World Minus One, which is derived partly from this book, I talk about how, because of Trump, thanks to Trump actually, many Western nations have moved to build bridges with the global South, like European Union signing a big trade deal with India, the mother of trade deals, or with the Mercosur countries, and you see a lot of this inter-regional cooperation. Canada mending ties with China, and this is going to continue, and that's the kind of cooperation that will really be conducive to greater world order, a better world order, because the West versus the rest has been very destructive, and the basis of the class of civilization. When Samuel Huntington talked about class of civilizations, he was talking about West versus the rest, exactly that. Okay. I'm also not arguing a caveat that past civilizations are models. I don't never say that. But by studying history, we can look at the possibilities. There are different types of world order, different types of ideas. Many of them are actually shared creations, and therefore we have, first of all, don't lose hope that world order is going to collapse. Secondly, we have a broader menu of choices that we can draw on, maybe mix and match a bit to build the next world order. And that is the challenge for policymakers and policy-oriented academics. I call it a global multiplex, but I haven't really, my book is mostly about history and how we got here, not about what will go next, but maybe that's the next task. Okay, so these are some of the elements that I highlight in my book, that these are the foundational elements. I call them foundational elements, not fundamental, but foundational. In broad brush, maybe imperfect forms, they were created in many different places. So a system of independent states first originated in Sumer. Now we call it Westphalia. Maybe the more kind of purified form is Westphalia. But the idea that states will be independent, so have control over their own destiny, is not a very new idea. So I'm going back to the foundations. Great power cooperation and management, very important element of managing world order, started in the Near East, in the Amana system, well before the concept of more than almost 2,000 years before the concept of Europe. In Europe, the European balance of power system was not the first, the only successful type of management by great powers of order. Peace treaties, non-aggression, religious and ethnic tolerance, protecting people against cruel and unjust punishment, right to life and property, reciprocity, freedom of the seas, peaceful confederation of polities, Native American Iroquois, for example, sustainable ecology, self-determination, humanitarian intervention, like intervening in another country to protect its own people, and that we call it R2P, philosophical inquiry, how the origin of universe came about in a rational way, not by God, but through natural forces and human agency. Many of these are foundational to contemporary world order, and many of them are created either independently or through diffusion in multiple parts of the world. And in my book, I provide a lot of examples, looking by region and civilization. Here is one example of great power management, comparing the concept of Europe in the 19th century to the Egyptian-centered great power, what I call Amarna system, because the evidence for these letters about this were discovered in a place called Amarna, which is named after the Pharaoh Akhenaten's new capital in the Egyptian New Dynasty, about 15th century BC. Now, the European concert kept peace only for 50 years from from the Napoleonic War, 1815 Congress of Vienna, to the Crimean War, 1854. And maybe you can extend it to World War I, maybe 100 years. The Amarna system had no great power war for 200 years. Absolutely. Much more successful. Similar ideas of great power management, through diplomacy, through gift giving, and mostly bilateral, but under a shared cultural and normative framework, and through diplomacy, actually. So there's a great book called Amarna Diplomacy by Westbrook, and I think it's called Amarna Diplomacy. And you can read it, but you can take a look at the section in my book. I'll go to the next one. Okay. Well, this is the first peace treaty. Just to look at this, the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty. Hatti will not trespass against Egypt. Egypt will not trespass against Hatti, and very similar to the UN non-aggression pact. So this was between Egypt and Hatti, the two great powers or superpowers of the ancient Near East around the middle of the second millennium BC. The book on Amarna Diplomacy, I remember Raymond Westbrook and Raymond Cohen. But I kind of expand on that in my book. Okay, so the Egypt and Hatti fought a war to a draw. Neither side, both sides claimed victory. Neither side actually won the war, which is what happens all the time. And then they signed a treaty where they actually agreed not to trespass on each other's territory forever, and they observed it. It's a little bit like US and Iran these days. And also extradition, not giving sanctuary to rebels from another state, the other state. So Hatti will not allow a terrorist or a rebel from Egypt to seek asylum in Hatti, and Egypt will do likewise, not shelter a dissident or a rebel from from Egypt in Hatti. So mutual non-interference, not giving asylum to rebels from each other is a foundational principle of non-intervention. And also built into that is extradition. Hatti can turn over Egyptian rebel, and Egypt can turn over Hatti as a rebel. And moving into one more example, there are many, but I can talk about freedom of the seas. This existed in the Indian Ocean as a practice for about 1,000 years. So we give credit to Hugo Grotius, but Hugo Grotius was on the payroll of Dutch East India Company, who basically were trying to justify why they sank a Portuguese ship off Singapore, because Portuguese are not allowing the Dutch to have trade in the Indian Ocean. They were the first, they didn't allow, the Dutch were the next. And Grotius was hired by the Dutch East India Company to justify why the Dutch should sink and loot a Portuguese ship and sell its products or cargo in Europe. And Grotius said, sea is common to everybody, so we should not let any country, including the Portuguese, to harass our shipping. But that principle, where did he get this idea from? That principle existed in the Indian Ocean. So as you can see, the Sultan of Makassar, God made the land and sea. The land he divided among men, and the sea he gave in common. It has never been heard that anyone should be forbidden to sell the seas. He said that when the Dutch, after defeating the Portuguese and making such a big fuss about freedom of the seas, actually went on creating a bigger monopoly than the Portuguese. They colonized entire Indonesia, and they asked the Sultan of Goa to trade through them rather than directly with Malacca and the Spice Islands. And when the Sultan refused, he destroyed the Makassar, the Goa Sultanate, and called it something like New Amsterdam or New Rotterdam. But Grotius, who was on the payroll of Dutch East India Company, actually was considered the father of international law, liberalism, and one of the fathers, and freedom of the seas. But in reality, he was a justifier of imperialism. And he was basically following what was an idea and practice that existed in the Indian Ocean. And a good example being Malacca. Malacca in the 15th century was open, more than 80 national languages spoken. Trade was decided, the rules of trade, not by the Sultan of Malacca, but by a committee of 10 traders. 10 traders, the Arabs, Indian, Gujarati and Kalinga, Coromandel, Chinese, Javanese, Thai. So committee of 10 decided the rules of the trade. The rules are standard, rules-based. You know exactly what commission you have to, what customs duty you have to pay, between 4 to 6%. And arbitration was done by them. It is rules-based because we know, we have texts. There is a text called Undang-Undang Laut Malacca, Maritime Laws of Malacca, which still exists, and it was drafted not by Hugo Grotius, kind of scholar, a legalist, but by actual sea captains who conducted this trade. So the idea that rules-based order is a Western invention is also a bit of a myth. Okay, humanitarian values, that's probably my last example, but there are examples from every civilization. Just compare the Geneva Conventions with the Code of Manu. Not harming civilians, not harming a soldier who is sick or disarmed or has surrendered. Geneva Conventions. The Code of Manu also says, Indian text of 1st century AD, when he fights with his foes, let him not strike, who joins the palms of his hands in supplication, who sits down, who I'm dying, who sleeps, who is disarmed, who is looking on without taking part in the fight, which is basically civilians. So why we give credit to the Geneva Convention? This could be kind of also very much a practice from ancient India. So if you go like this, I have examples, I don't have time to go, in Andean reciprocity and relationality, very different from the Chinese tributary system. It was a social reciprocity, not an imperial reciprocity. It actually happened in society, it was ingrained into Inca society, much more universal than the tributary system, which was applied selectively. And then I want to conclude. Okay, a couple of quick slides. Why I wrote this book? Because in 2014, I was teaching a course at American University to undergraduates, and I was looking for a text, and Henry Kissinger had just published this text called World Order, the best-selling book on world order today. And I looked at it at the beginning, so chapter 1 from Europe, it's basically Westphalia. Chapter 2, also from Europe, and this is a concept of Europe. Chapter 3, Islam, but a world in disorder. An assumption that Islam cannot create order, although Islam created more order than Europeans ever did. And then Iran, of course, is always the bugbear of the West. And the multiplicity of Asia, China gets a little, India and China get little sections. And then we are all ending up in the United States, acting for all mankind. So that's the kind of writing that we have underpinning writings about not only world order, but international relations, and we're all trained in that. Policymakers think like that. And looking at that book, I still use it as a text, but primarily to tell my students what the kind of book where Eurocentrism and American centrism comes from. It doesn't really talk about Africa. It doesn't talk about the Americas before Columbus. Asia is marginally highlighted. Islam is cast negatively. So I wanted to write a book which starts from Sumer, Egypt, Assyria, Greece, India, China, Rome, and Islam, all the way to the United States. So you have to have a much more broader perspective. And through this, I found a couple of things. One is that civilizations, there's no single civilization that created all this world order. The Europeans, because they were dominant powers and the Western powers in the 19th and 20th century, they adopt the most recent version of a particular idea, like sovereignty, territoriality, or freedom of the seas. But they then claim ownership. And they claim ownership because a lot of the words we have in IR, world order, are from Greek or Latin. But that doesn't mean Greeks and Romans invented it. That's how the language have invented. So just because hegemony comes from Greek doesn't mean Greeks practice hegemony or invented hegemony. Or sovereignty comes from Latin doesn't mean Romans invented sovereignty. So a lot of the ideas and practices are named by European, in the era of European and American dominance, and they appear as if they are European Western constructs. But Europeans and Americans basically were able to give the name to it, the latest, most recent version of these ideas. The foundational ideas are already there. And you bring this out, the world order looks the origins and creation of world order looks very different. It was certainly not a European idea, not an American idea. It is really shared, diffuse shared. Some civilizations do more of something, others do less, more of something else, but it's spread all over history. So let me conclude now to how we can use this book for study of international relations. Well, again, first thing is that if you are a undergraduate, a graduate, or faculty, you want to do research on what we call origins of ideas, genealogy, what we call. I think often our textbooks start with Westphalia, World War II, things I mentioned, like anarchy, hierarchy, empire, hegemony, sovereignty, free trade, norms, just war. You can actually find this book, the origins of these concepts goes much more deeper and wider. So your research will be much more helped. You will have more creativity than the same old using the same textbooks or same classic books. Ground theories, hegemonic stability theory, for example, neorealism, that bipolar worlds are stable than multipolar worlds. Where does this come from? Again, from very European-American Cold War experience. You'll find that there is actually history of bipolarity, multipolarity. Even though I don't use the term, I actually find that multipolar systems are not necessarily unstable. Just like the concept of powers, but like the Amana system, 200 years of peace. You can have multipolar systems that are stable. So don't buy the Kenneth Waltz logic, the stability, or John Mearsheimer logic, that bipolar worlds are more stable than multipolar worlds. And the liberal world order, inclusivity, stability, and prosperity. That's, again, far from the rules-based order, the universality of these ideas. It's not American-owned. The American-led liberal hegemony that John talks about is actually in some way partially true. I mean, it took off after 1945. But there were genesis to that earlier. And if only the liberal scholars can acknowledge that, I'll be all for it. So I don't use the term liberal order. I call it universal order or something, a shared co-creation, co-created world order. And class of civilization, false. Because Huntington's book only goes back to about 100 years. If you look back to 5,000 years, there are many examples of peaceful spread of civilizations, peaceful interactions between countries. So are we going to think of the future in the basis of what has happened in the last 100 years or what has happened in the last 5,000 years? And end of history is, of course, a complete nonsense. So the history has always moved and changed. Orders have always risen and fallen as nation states. And another very important thing you can do is expand case studies. So now when you're writing your dissertation or essays, you need case studies. And all the cases we seem to look from the contemporary period. Now you can actually go back and look at history, deep history, not just European history. So I'm writing a paper now that looks at great power cooperation from concept of powers to the Amana period, 15th century BC to 19th century AD. So I have freedom of seas. Where did this idea come from? Well, you have another case study from the Indian Ocean. I have looked at property rights and interstate confederation, interstate cooperation, the Iroquois in North America and in the West African, the Mandan Charter. There are many other case studies open up, and then your dissertations and books and essays will become much richer. History is more easily available now, but this book will be kind of a table of contents for you, like an index for you to go in. And same as just war principles, economic openness, peace treaties. So those are the three major benefits, but overall, it will address the Eurocentric, Western-centric dominance of the field. Now, it is very difficult to convince some academics. We are all trained, many of you in Korea are trained in the United States, the textbooks used in the US. I find this great resonance of this book in Europe than in the United States. And Europe is already changing its mind, not just because of the book, but because of a whole period of global IR, which I also promoted, post-colonialism. The United States is the last frontier. But I think I'm not talking about this as an ethical, normative thing. It just makes the thing so intellectually more interesting, instead of doing the same old thing. And it's not that difficult to go back and look at a little history and use a different textbooks. Many of this book has a long bibliography, and you can find them. Now, internet has all the sources available. So I would like to say that this book will actually change the way IR is taught and researched, and it's already beginning to do that, not just because of me, but the earlier work of also non-Western IR theory, global IR, post-colonial theory, and the like. So I don't have much more to say. I'm writing an article. I want to conclude with Thucydides' trap, because in East Asia we have been talking about it. The Chinese president talked about Thucydides' trap when Trump visited him. It's completely wrong. There is a chapter in my book called Greek Myths and Persian Power. First of all, it's not a dyadic, binary competition. There was Persia, always big power. So who is Persia today? The power that looms over Athens and Sparta. I just came back 2 weeks in Greece, actually, and Athens and Peloponnese, and I visited some of the places the Peloponnesian War out of Habi took place. The Greek city-states were always manipulated by Persia. Now, Persia was supposedly defeated, but never really went away. It was Persian gold that got the Spartan-led coalition to win the Peloponnese War against Athens. Without Persia, this would have gone in a very different way. So if you want to use a historical analogy, do it correctly. So who is Persia today between the US and China? What is the scale of operations between, and Sparta has disappeared, by the way. You can't find Sparta these days. We went looking for it and couldn't find it. But anyway, that's one problem. The other thing is it's very Western-centric. 13 out of the 16 case studies are between non-Asian and Western nations. Non-Asian and or Western nations. So basically intra-Western affair. So 13 out of 16 cases have nothing to do with non-Western countries. How can you develop a grand theory, including a theory about China, about Thucydides' trap, from such a hugely Eurocentric bias? And the case that actually did not lead to the war was the USSR conflict. And that was because mainly for nuclear weapons. So Thucydides' trap, there was no nuclear weapons during the age of Thucydides. Also, there are also other intra-Asian cases that you could actually have used, like the Indian Nanda and Maurya dynasty rivalry. So this is what Western centrism gets us, basically a misplaced analogy or a limited analogy, but it gets a lot of attention because it comes from a Western professor. What I am trying to say is that you do history, that's fine with me, but do it in a way that actually is much more comprehensive and also, in a sense, looks at both sides of the equation. A more comprehensive, less Western-centered history will be useful. This is why this book will be useful not only for just IR scholars. I believe it will be also useful. Historians have written blogs for it, and I think it will recover history from this trap, the ethnocentric trap, not Thucydides trap, that IR scholars are really fallen without much of a choice, because the textbooks and the training is all manufactured, made in the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very encompassing, talk of the book. I think the Korean translation of the title seems misplaced. It doesn't really focus on 21st century, while there's a certain implication, but most of the book deals with the past, deals with history, and a variety of precedents of fundamental elements
So
of.
you said that most of the book is about history.
Right.
Absolutely. 90% of the book is about history.
Right.
The last chapter talks about some of
Right,
it.
right. So in that regard.
I'm kind of deriving implications.
Okay, sure.
Because this is beyond the book now.
Right, right. Anyway, thank you very much for the very passionate talk. And we have a discussant here, Professor Won-Duk Cho from the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. I'll give about 10 minutes. You can spend more time, of course. Okay. Professor Cho, please.
Thank you, Professor Ma, and thank you, Professor Acharya, for your very insightful intellectual discussions. And it is very honored for me to be discussions for Professor Acharya's books at the book concert. It seems to me it is the very interesting but even striking, because as a Professor Acharya pointed out that I actually studied in the United States. I mostly based on the United States American IR scholarships. At the same time, I usually be familiar with the concept of interests and the hierarchy and hegemon and rising power, usually based on the power transition theory. So your focus on the shared idea and the civilization is a little bit strange and even interesting for me to learn a variety of the things to understand in terms of a macro level discussions regarding the global international order. So I would like to a few points, raise a point to ask some questions. First of all, I think I'm very largely persuaded by the concept of multiplex rather than multipolar, in the sense that recently we have a number of diverse players, actors in the world, not just nation states, but also multinational corporation, NGOs, and scholars, pundits, and so on. So in that sense, including the all important and diverse players into the intellectual discussion is very meaningful and relevant, rather than using the polarity concept that usually the international IR scholarships have dealt with. But I think the multiplex order concept is interesting because in the book and also the discussions by the Professor Acharya, that there was no single civilizations. So the civilizations have many civilizations and not the single civilizations. So in that sense, I think it seems to me that you are pointing the possibility of the sphere of influence politics, because in the past there were a variety of civilization in certain geographical area and civilizations. So in similar vein, as the West or United States decline, and from that point to the emergence of the multiplex order, so I think that there are many regional civilization. It means that there might be a certain type of a sphere of influence. You know, it's the covering East Asia and covering Middle East, covering South America, and covering the East Africa or West Africa. So I think the without U.S. West and decline U.S. and West, there is no single civilization. There are a variety of the civilization, and it's similar to the emergence of a number of the sphere of influence. And also, you made a point regarding about the consequence of the decline of the West. It's that the decline of the West need not to be a catastrophe, and may in fact be good for the world. So I think the multiplex order will come after West decline, the weakened. So I wonder whether there will be peaceful or stable from the process from the decline of the West moving forward the multiplex order. I think just the decline of the West and the United States just directly go to the multiplexed order. So there is some transition period. So what do you think that the transition period will be peaceful or conflictual? So I can see that kind of discussion in your book, and also from my point about the middle power partnership. So as there is no hegemon from the West, and there might be plausibility and possibility of the middle power partnership among countries. So what do you think about the middle power partnership after the U.S. or the West decline? And at the same time, even if the U.S. or the West decline, I think there are some number of the countries which are prone to be satisfied with the system and institution that the West created. So they want to keep that institution and order intact rather than demise or. So I think so there might be perception difference between the certain countries, whether you want to revise the system and more proletariat and less hegemony, or you want to keep that system and institution order intact. And in your book said that the world order does not have to encompass the entire globe, and no true global world order has ever existed. You mentioned that, but for me, I think after the end of the Cold War, in the era of the U.S. primacy, I think that due to the hyper-globalization and the strong interdependence, I think the U.S.-led order is, I think, the global order. So from my point, and yeah, and that's the overall discussion point. from my perspective.
I cannot get the last question. Do you understand what is the point of the fifth question you mentioned?
You mean the question about
The global order is the
well,
known
how
global
long
order.
did it last? Let's say, 1990, unipolar moment to 2008, okay, at most. That's not a very long period in history. In a history of 5,000 years, so the scale of this book is much bigger. So you can say that the British led world order was also like sun never set in the British Empire, they used to say. And well, that was also a little bit long and maybe looked relatively stable. But you know, first of all, how many wars happened after the end of the Cold War? It was global as it can be. It came close to being global. I also mentioned that. Britain and the US came close to having a global order, but Britain could not control Europe because of continental Europe, balance of power system. And the United States, when people like Eikenberry talk about American-led world order, they start from 1945, not 1990. So the book actually, their span is from 1945, or even earlier, Woodrow Wilson and the United Nations. So that period was actually not global, far from it. So China, Soviet Union, India, the non-aligned world. Unless you talk about, oh, I have an order, you are all part of it because it's me. This is like saying that I have this Southeast Asia Treaty Organization that the US created. I'm going to defend you whether you like it or not. So that's what basically Dulles said. So you are part of my order, whether you like it or not. But the Chinese and the Americans, Russians and the Indians are not part of the liberal order. So you are claiming their inclusion on behalf of them when they did not. They are not part of it. So that's also a kind of a very hypocritical and wrong. Now, from 1990 onwards, end of the fall of the Berlin Wall to the, maybe you can say, the global financial crisis, 2008. Yes, there was an extension of that order. Many countries were, buying into the, the end of history thesis, the free market, and there was, a period of revival of the United Nations with under U.S. leadership. But again, the Iraq War in 2003 was not with a UN mandate. It was unilateral by the United States. There were wars, plenty of wars, Somalia, Iraq, and the statistics is that the wars declined about 30 to 40% in the first 10, 15 years of the end of the Cold War, but then it picked up again when the US was still the dominant power. So yes, you can say there was a global order for like 20, 30 years at most, but that's not really to say that world orders are generally global. They mostly have been regional.
That order is still now going on, right? It's not.
I don't think so. I mean, if you think so, then maybe, what is happening to Trump. Trump is destroying it himself quite a lot. The free trade system, the WTO is replaced by reciprocal tariffs. Trump is even destroying NATO. So the NATO was one of the big underpinnings of the liberal order. And European Union is Trump's enemy. So Trump is not the creator of this destruction. He is kind of accelerating it, pushing it over the edge. The decline of this order had happened for structural reasons because of the inevitable rise of other powers. So the United States is basically an accidental superpower or a number one country because after 1945, all the competitors of the United States were down and out. So Europe was destroyed by World War II, Japan defeated, Germany defeated, and India and China were still under colonial rule. So only the United States, I made this point earlier in the other panel, that the United States could claim 50% of the world's GDP and more than 50% of the world's manufacturing capacity. But as the Europeans recovered, the Chinese started building, it's gradually eroded. So the United States went down to maybe 24-25%, which is still high, but it's not hegemony in that sense. But because the US was able to provide the market access, and that's the big thing, market access. The US market is the largest market in the world. In 1950s, US was the largest exporter in the world. In 1990s, it became the largest importer, and every major economy became dependent on the US, including China, European Union, India. And Trump came into office and said, oh, I love tariffs. Why? Because that's one weapon I can use against everybody else. And imposing tariffs is the most beautiful thing for him, as he said, and he can create it. So the dependency on the US basically gave Trump a weapon, but to undermine the order that he was actually capitalizing on. And how long can he do it? So my answer is that the liberal order is gone. I mean, I am actually, in some ways, one of the first people to say that, but I'm not the only one. So I can tell you that so many leaders of the European Union's Commission, the idea of the West, okay. So Canadian Prime Minister, we know the story of the international rules-based order. This is a liberal order. The fiction was useful. The illusion begins to crack. Nostalgia is not a strategy. The era of Western dominance is over. I mean, this is coming from the former High Representative Josep Borrell of the European Union's foreign and security policy, or European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, or Alexander Stubb. I mean, the Western countries are beginning to realize, finally, it's like after denying and denying, they're beginning to accept it. Now, even in the United States, you'll find that magazines like Foreign Affairs finally beginning to accept it. So, I mean, the liberal order is not going to be totally disappear because it was not American to start with. There are, as I said, my big argument is the foundational element, like freedom of the seas, not an American concept. It's a rules-based trade is not an American concept. So because it has a universal basis, some elements of it endure. But the word that it is hegemonic, that's what I'm challenging in the book, that there will be no single hegemonic order. There will be multiplicity of orders, and the US has to negotiate its place within that, rather than say, I am the one, I am above international law, or this is the order. So that's what multiplexity is about that.
Other countries want to keep the order that the United States created but dissatisfied with.
It's, sorry,
some countries.
Some countries, yeah.
Some countries and allies, partners, which want to preserve existing order.
Maybe Korea does. I mean, I can understand because your security is so dependent on it. Maybe Taiwan does. To some extent, even Singapore is federal. But I don't think that's the discourse in Canada. That's the discourse in the Canadians want to maintain some aspects of it, but the Canadians have very clearly said they have to move out of it because it's not trustworthy. The European Union, I visited a couple of times recently, met Josep Borrell. They also don't want to trust the American leadership of their order. That doesn't mean they want to move away from the principles, but they're not American. There's a couple of chapters in this book, and one chapter, 11, talks about how the whole multilateral system was a shared creation. And in fact, the United States was a minority when it comes to some aspects of human rights. There were Europeans, there were Australians, there were actually Republican China, some Indian participation on Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So although it actually was held in San Francisco, the UN was actually created. 30 countries out of 49, including Poland will be 50, were actually from what we call today Global South. So we have, I think what has happened is this narrative of the liberal order has been so powerful that we have forgotten. There's a great book by Eric Leiner called The Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods, uncovering all these contributions because they never get highlighted. And the second thing is that this belief is a groupthink, international groupthink, that is very dangerous. Because we all believe as if that's actually what happened, and because the think tanks in Washington and textbooks in the West make us think like that. And when the order starts to crack, people are confused. Because of the United States withdrawing, the whole world is collapsing. I mean, there will be some, you asked the question about transition. Transitional periods are always problematic, yes. But if you want to say the world is on fire, and first of all, that's not a very helpful attitude policy-wise. So you're basically having a self-fulfilling prophecy. And secondly, you have to ask who started these fires. Where did most of the most consequential wars of post-Cold War period, whether it's Iraq, 2003, or now Afghanistan, Syria, and to some extent Libya, underpinning all that are some sort of a role of either very arrogant, confident, short-sighted policies of the liberal powers. So who started these fires? You have to ask that question. You cannot say the fires are being caused by only the global south countries. So if you look at it that way, you'll find that the transitional periods are always full of conflict. But the war order before the transitional period was not very peaceful, except Europe. Europe had no wars because of nuclear weapons and deterrence. But the wars all over the global south, millions and millions of people died, and partly because of interventions by both the US and the Soviet Union.
Well, I think some of the questions that Professor Cho raised are not really answered yet, but I think because
well, I can answer, but
right
but maybe
after some of the audience may have questions too. Okay, gentleman over there. Okay. No. Well, in the back, and
please,
then
slowly and loudly. I can hard to hear in this room. Come forward a bit.
Sorry, Acharya, Professor Acharya. I listened to your speech for many times.
would you please introduce yourself briefly?
I'm Shirley, Professor Shirley, from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences.
Okay.
Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Also a professor for the University of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Is clear?
Right. Okay.
Okay. So I have 3 questions for you. The question 1 is, you say you don't use the multipolar, you like to use the multiplexer, which means, in your opinion, who is the actors for the new order? Is it the state-based or international order, or civilization-based world order, or the actors were from the different levels or different kinds? They come together in you under your framework. That's one. The question number 2 is the mechanism. How do your mechanism works? Because they are need the mechanism to make you the framework acceptable or pursuing for all of the readers. The question number 3 is you said the Korean version has been translated. What about the Chinese version? Is it come out, or somebody were to be the translator? If already somebody, that's okay. If no, it will be great honor for me to translate this one into the Chinese.
So you have to explain that to me. I'm not following.
He is wondering if there's anybody who's translating your book into Chinese.
Yeah.
And if there's none, he wants to do that.
Translate to China. Okay.
Yeah.
Because why? Because I'm also work on the comparison of the civilization competition and their perspective of the world order for about 6 years. So I agree 80% of your opinion. Because so now you say maybe the people who get training in the United States will disagree with your opinion. But I think it depends on what kind of the IR theory they agree with. For the realists, they don't agree. For the liberalists, maybe they will accept. But for the constructivists, I think they will, generally speaking, they will agree with you.
Okay.
I'm a constructivist.
Constructive of what?
I don't know. Well, by the way, would you please answer the first two questions first?
Yeah. The Chinese translation is about to come out. It's being translated into Chinese by CITIC Press. I guess CITIC is a very famous publisher. The translator, Henry Kissinger's all his books. It should be out in the summer. I really did not quite get, but the first question was about multiplex, right? So how is the multiplex order going to work out, the elements? Well, first of all, let me remind you, this is a book of history, and only the last chapter talks about multiplex. I try to extend the argument because everybody latches onto this multiplex concept. Most of the argument is about the shared co-creation of world order. That is not a monopoly, and looking at very specific ideas and institutions, like from independence of states, hierarchy, hegemony, anarchy, all the concepts that we are familiar with, free trade. That's the real key argument. Where the multiplex comes in is in the last chapter, when you talk about the world order is in transition, what kind of order we're getting into next, and there are many ways of describing it. So people have talked about multipolarity is the default position. Everybody talks about multipolarity, but there are words like multi-order and multinodal, apolar, there's no poles, non-polar, Richard has talked about, and all these things have some logic to it, but none of them is perfect. I mean, these are as words go, and I don't think multiplex is perfect. But in a multiplex, and the difference between multipolar and multiplex is there are two major differences. So multiplex takes into account a lot more actors, consequential actors. No definition of multipolarity includes middle powers or regional powers or non-state actors. It's all about great powers. I mean, every word has a baggage, right? That's how the concept came about from Europe, the concept system, European multipolarity. Polarity is about great powers. And economic power is defined in material terms, economic and military. So in a multiplex, we have a lot more actors, which is not a revolutionary new thing. People have been talking about expansion of actors. Global governance literature have been talking about it, including some of my writings, of who governs the globe. So it's not just the states or powers, non-state actors. But I also bring in middle powers and regional powers where Korea could actually fit in, Indonesia will fit in, and they play a consequential role, and sometimes in the respective regions or in a particular issue area. That's the other thing about multiplexity, about multipolarity. Multipolarity assumes that power is not only approximately equally distributed, there has to be approximate equality, otherwise there will be no multipolarity. But also, the great powers lead in every issue area. Now, in a unipolar world, one power leads. In bipolar, two powers. But we now see that leadership in global governance is actually quite issue-specific. And the region, multi-level. So at the regional level, you find a different dynamic in Africa, in Southeast Asia, for example, Indonesia. And even at the global level, you'll find that regional institutions like European Union are actually quite good at norm setting on things like copyright and human rights and standard setting and environmental regulation. And you will see that in military power, United States leads. In economic power, when it comes to infrastructure development, China is leading. So I see this as kind of more diffuse pattern of leadership, which is not captured in multipolarity. And the third difference would be that in a multipolar world, it's kind of basically has a baggage, okay? Came out of the 19th century. And I was mentioning, what about interaction capacity? Some of the countries, you can be very powerful, but we may not want to or would be willing to interact in a positive way. Maybe, and that's what the United States has been doing since Trump was elected. So other countries are more constructively interactive, like European Union's free trade agreements with Mercosur and India are a good example. So power is issue-specific. Power is exercise of power is through interactions, and it's a complex world. I think multipolarity is true in one part of this equation. So the distribution of material power is multipolar. I agree with that. But world order is much bigger. It's a layer around it, which is based on ideas and interactions. They don't correspond with power. Sometimes the middle power has provided the most interesting norms, for example. The responsible sovereignty, the Canada, peacekeeping came from Canada. Human security also, and the Scandinavian countries have, in the past, provided a lot of ideas. So it depends on how narrow or how broadly you define world order, and if you just say world order is all about power, I think, oh yeah, we're in a multipolar world. But if you think world order is more than power and has ideas and norms, and also want to get out of the baggage, you have to include the non-great powers, which actually can be very influential regionally. I mean, you cannot understand Southern Africa without South Africa's role, West Africa without Nigeria's role, Southeast Asia without Indonesian role. So are we going to bring them in, or are we going to just keep in a very narrow view of world order? So that's what I'm arguing in this book.
손?
손대권 at Seogang University. And first of all, thanks for the wonderful talk. I really appreciate it. And I gotta tell you that, 3 weeks ago, I actually concluded my entire semester by introducing your book to my student. So I was inspired by your book to that point. And as a person who have done my PhD studies in China, unlike many other professors in Korea, I believe I am...
Well, my hearing here is not good.
Really? Is it clear?
Please ask your question in a precise and
Okay.
very...
Ask me shoot a straight question, or we can talk. I can go over there.
It's okay, it's okay. Let me just be...
My hearing in a big room is often have acoustics problem and hearing problem.
Okay, let me just be concise. One may argue that your book talk a lot about the existence of the prototype idea that were quite similar to the current element of the world order. But problem is that the existence of those prototype idea in non-Western region does not necessarily mean that they affected or shaped the current world order. So it was not really clear for me the way those prototype idea in non-Western region were channeled or brought into the Western society and was embedded or embodied in the current world order. So could you please elaborate a little bit more about the mechanism?
Okay, so how non-Western ideas have affected the current world order? That's a great question. So there are many examples, but I think I don't look at sometimes things as I said, world order is partly independent creation, okay? So the Inca civilization created a particular way of managing empire in a decentralized way. That was very similar to the Mongol Empire or the Gupta Empire. Again, broad similarities, not exact replicas. And, but there was no diffusion. We don't know of any. So we have ideas of territorial integrity from ancient Sumer that are actually very similar to the idea of modern boundaries, boundary markers. But another argument is there is a diffusion, connection between civilizations or regions or nations learning from each other. And that's mostly we know that when you talk about non-Western influences on the West, we know some of that, like from China, the 5 inventions, like gunpowder, compass, paper, and the like. But we know about Islamic navigation playing an important role in Western navigation systems, or Islamic medicine, very influential on Western medicine. Islamic, like trigonometry, for example, algebra, again, very, very powerful astronomy, Indian zero. These are diffusions that the West got from the rest. But I think I'm not talking about only scientific and technological ideas. I'm talking about political ideas, philosophical ideas. I'm talking about something called eternity of the world. The world was not created by God, but by natural forces, now which we credit to enlightenment, or Greeks. But actually, we have ideas in Rig Veda, in Indian text of 14th century BC, which actually talks about God did not create the universe. Universe was created. We don't know who created the universe. But if we created, there were elements like water and air that already existed. So, and this is also an Egyptian idea that the Greeks borrowed, philosophers like Thales, for example. So another idea, I give you the example of Chinese civil service. In the section on Chinese civil service exams, the Europeans directly borrowed it. Very clear, the Jesuits came to China, looked at this, and said at the time of the European French Revolution, when philosophers like Voltaire wanted to get rid of the ancient regime, the old Europe, and they said killing the French king is not enough if the civil service is the life. So you have to change the civil service, because you would remove the head of the snake, but the snake's body is in that sense. So he said, we have to reform the civil service. We have to, before they would recruit only from the aristocracy, the sons and daughters of lords. The Chinese system was that anybody can take the exam. And if you pass, you become a magistrate. And this system that has been adopted in Vietnam here and in Japan. And the Europeans adopted it, the French adopted it, and the British also got the same idea from, partly from the French, but also from the British East India Company in Canton, in Guangzhou. Basically looked at this and said, we have to do this, because all our British foreign employees are basically privileged people. And we want to really make it more professional. The British Foreign Service Commission report, I have a slide on this, I didn't have time to go through it, basically said most of the British civil servants are either not interested or capable of civil service. Some of them could not read or write, almost idiots. That's the British Treasury Secretary Trevelyan wrote. And they adopted this Chinese service. And the Americans got the idea, and they said, we cannot be seen to be accepting an idea from China. Because China, they said China is the most enlightened of Eastern civilizations, but we cannot adopt it. However, if the British have adopted it, and we have adopted so many things from Britain, it's okay for us. So these are actually proven. And what is more important than order building than a civil service? Far more important than the leadership recruitment, because the bureaucracy keeps you stable. Right? Order is about stability. And I find also similar ideas about, this is parallel creation, but the Iroquois, or Iroquois, some Americans will spell it, in Confederacy, which lasted for 500 years, when the US was Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was happening, the US was drafting its constitution, and Benjamin Franklin looked at the Iroquois and said, if the Iroquois can do it, why can't we do it? And there is a very clear evidence that some founding fathers were very impressed by the Iroquois, 500 years of maintaining peace. Now, that's another one. And the free trade in the Indian Ocean. Where did Hugo Grotius get the idea of mare liberum? There was no mare liberum in Europe. The Roman Mediterranean and sea, they're all what they call mare closum, closed sea. Countries could carve out parcels of territory from the sea. Venice and Genoa, big trading states in Mediterranean, they all had their maritime spheres of influence, all right? Whereas Indian Ocean, anybody can trade. You don't have to be part of, and empires did not matter. The Chinese empire did not matter. The Indian empire did not matter. It was led by small port city states, as I was trying to explain to you. It was East African states, Malindi, Mombasa, Mogadishu, Aden, Hormuz in Arabian Peninsula, Calicut, and then east coast of India, Maliputam, Malacca. Trade was managed by a group of small, little port city states and open trading. And this is why when the Portuguese went to Malacca, they said whoever controls Malacca has its hand on the throat of Venice. This trade is amazingly effective because it is open. Nobody is controlling it. No empire is controlling it. Moral of the story, you don't need a hegemon to have free trade. In fact, after I wrote this book, I read that Stephen Krasner has said that hegemony is not necessary for free trade. There are other ways of maintaining free trade, including by a group of small committed traders. This is the arch realist, Stephen Krasner, that you must have read. So, but I had not look at it, but now I use it because there's an article in Foreign Policy I wrote about this. And so you have many, many examples of these ideas that originated outside of the West. Now, I don't want to make too much of a distinction between West and the non-West, because these conceptions only came about in the 20th century. So before that, it was geography was very diffuse. And the Greeks called the Europeans as not Greek, barbarians, same as Asians. So there was no concept of Europe, that Greece was part of it. Romans also considered the Europeans as barbarians, and they were closer to Africa and Asia. So this idea that the West versus the rest, they're very artificial. That doesn't make sense if you go back in history. There are, of course, spheres of influence, there are empires, but the idea of a distinctive Europe, distinctive West, distinctive rest did not exist. So I am trying to look at circulation, intermingling of ideas. Ideas coming from multiple sources, and then they come together because the West named them. Western imperial powers in the 19th, 20th century, because of their hierarchy of knowledge production, control over textbooks, they actually put them together. Now, and just because they did it doesn't mean they invented it. They might have been scribes that put together the fundamental ideas and named them in Greek and Latin origins with English and French modern equivalents, because they were the ones that are producing knowledge at that time. But that doesn't mean the essence of these ideas what actually came from the West.
All right, time is already over. Thank you very much for Professor Acharya and Professor Won-Duk Cho and other people who asked questions from the audience. Thank you very much.